Today, what we're going to do is do a little kind of a wander through a garden. We're going to wander through actually the Garden of Eden and our creation stories or myths. And we're going to meet some interesting folks while we do that. And then we're going to talk about some specific spiritual practices and connections to specifically Christian liturgy. As Lori mentioned, I speak both. I'm a convert to Judaism. And so one of my passions besides gardening is actually the interweaving, I'm an interfaith family, of our traditions. So I want to talk about three introductory concepts before we start walking through the garden. And first of all, those primary relationships and experiences that you just described with gardens, if you can imagine when humans lived in that kind of relationship with Earth, with the ecosystem all the time, right? So back in the dawn of human history, we were utterly in this incredibly intimate relationship with the ecosystem. We have a really hard time imagining that because of the way we live now and because of some divisions in our language actually about nature. We kind of think about it as out there and over there and not part of our ecosystem. But so responding to the wonders, the taste of carrots, the taste of tomatoes, right? The taste of cucumbers, the wonders of living in this ecosystem, the terrors, the rhythms, the cycles, the mysteries, the scarcity and abundance becomes the foundational understanding in human consciousness of divinity or God, and gave birth to practices, rituals, language, symbols, and then stories, poems, songs that become our scriptures, right? As we move through time, that gave voice to this understanding of God or divinity. But it's primarily comes originally in community or nature. So if you think about the central symbols, for example, of Easter or Debbie of Passover, okay? With Easter, we have sacred fire, which illuminates the light and darkness, right? Scented oil, we have bread, we have wine. These are all the waters of baptism. These are all very primal types of symbols, right? They're common everywhere. In Passover, we have some of the similar symbols. We have flatbread and a wine. We have parsley, right? Because it is the first herb of spring. So we imbue these as humans, imbue these elements of our ecosystem with depth meaning about God. So that's a basic principle of this. Okay, now we're going to jump to another principle, which is that when I talk about nature or outdoors, I don't mean it as someplace else. It's every place that we live as human beings. We tend to think about nature in parks or outdoors, like Forest Park is nature, my yard maybe not so, right? Or my house maybe not so. Somebody recently said to me, we have to bring an understanding of ecosystems that lead us to understand the environment, having a safe environment, having a clean, healthy environment, not only means clean water, clean air, clean earth, it also means living without police brutality, right? So it's all aspects of how we live in this world as humans. Okay, finally, I want to talk, I'm using a translation of the scriptures that is done by Everett Fox. It is very close to how the Hebrew actually speaks. So it's going to kind of shake up some of our concepts. And one of those concepts is the use of Yod He Vav He, or the YHWH, right? So I want to give you a little teaching about this. It's called the Tetragrammon, the Unpronounceable Name of God, right? So Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who is an eminent 87-year-old amazing teacher, I just finished a class with him, talks about trying to pronounce Yod He Vav He in Hebrew. It comes out as breath and only breath. right? So it's Yah and Weh. So he says that this is actually reflective that God's name is the great interbreathing of the planet that exchanges plant breath for mammal breath, or the CO2 and the O2 exchange, right? And that in every breath that we take, we are saying God's name. He also talks about that this name can be said and is part of every language, because every language has breathy vowels in it. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we're reading through the scriptures. How comfortable are folks with shared reading? Do we want to run around the Zoom room and okay. So we're going to jump into this elemental foundational story that we all share in our traditions. So we're going to do this kind of Jewish text study style, which is a little different than how Christianity works with scripture. So you're going to notice that they're not necessarily in the right order. And so we're making some different links with it. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to have somebody read, and then I'm going to offer a little comment as we walk through this. We have 8 slides of scripture, and then we're going to jump into Episcopalian liturgy, which will be really exciting. And then we're going to look at some other spiritual practices. So would somebody like to take this first slide? Shall we just go? Joy, are you comfortable reading?
Okay.
Okay.
At the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, when the earth was wild and waste, darkness over the face of the ocean, rushing spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. Genesis 42.
So this is from Genesis 1, 1 and 2. So the things that pop up, and I'm going to talk about the things that popped up as I studied these texts through the week in preparation for today, that we have this sense of spirit, of wind, and of hovering. That's a very bird image. And the notion of face, you are going to see emerge over and over in this narrative. And face used relative to earth, which to me is an indication of our relationship. This opening always fills me with awe. This whole notion of God like creating and bringing order to this universe that we live in. Okay, now let me see. Here we go. This is the second. Denise, would you like to read the second?
God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the heaven to separate the day from the night, that they may be for signs, for set times, for days and years, and let them be for lights in the dome of the heavens to provide light upon the earth." It was so. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light for ruling the day and the smaller light for ruling the night, and the stars. God placed them in the dome of the heavens to provide light upon the earth, to rule the day and the night, to separate the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good. There was setting, there was dawning, 4th day.
That we hear in this, and this is going to become important as we look at liturgical cycles, is that the heavenly rhythms of light really inform our secular time and our sacred time. So both traditions, the day begins at the evening, at the setting in the last line. And we're going to look at, in terms of the liturgical cycle, that things are ordered along the solstices and the equinoxes. Whoops. Okay. So, Rudy, would you like to read the next slide? Rudy, you're not, you're muted.
Am I muted now or am I unmuted?
Now we can hear you.
Okay. At the time of Yahweh, God made of heaven and earth. No bush of the field was yet on earth. No plant on the field was yet sprung up. For Yahweh God had not made it rain upon the earth. And there was no human Adam to till the soil. Hashem?
Adama.
Adamah. But a surge would well up from the ground in the water at the face of the soil, and Yahweh God formed the human of dust and from the soil. He blew into the nostril the breath of life, and the human became a living being.
So in this text, we hear the Hebrew is full of wordplay and word relationships. And so Adam or Adam, this becomes the name of the first man, and Adamah, those words and the word Adamah means soil or earth, it's what we plant in, are so closely related that you can hardly take them apart, right? They're practically the same word with the exception of the last which we have a hard time articulating the closeness of this relationship in English. The closest thing we can get is earth and earthling, which makes us think of science fiction and aliens. But that's what, the Hebrew scriptures are telling us about the closeness of our relationship with the earth. Rabbi Waskow also talks about this as being a birth story or a birthing story, because the human is birthed and then breath, right? The human is made. The other piece I love about this, how God is imaged in this, which is the second set of creation stories in Genesis, there's actually two, is God is this amazing, active doer on earth. So God is actually like a potter forming us out of the clay. Not the kind of the God in the first myth is more almost like a wizard, like by voice are these things happening. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay. I have lost track of who has read and who hasn't, so will somebody just jump in there each slide for me?
Starting where?
Starting where? So at the
All right.
beginning of this slide.
Yahweh God planted a garden.
Yes.
Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden, land of pleasure, and there he placed the human whom he had formed. Yahweh God caused to spring up from the soil every type of tree, desirable to look at and good to eat, and the tree of life in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowing of good and evil.
You can
Yahweh
continue,
God,
Leslie. Yeah.
Yahweh God, hi Karen, took the human and set him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to watch, shomer, guard it.
So several concepts come up in here. God is gardener. Like this whole notion of being a gardener is core to even who God is, right? And how we image God is our interrelationship. So, and also we learn in here that humans and plants emerge and evolve together, that it is this deep relationship between humans and plants. And the other piece is this whole notion of shomer adamah. So to work it and to watch it, some translations is tend or till, but this is the notion of guard as in guardian. We guard Shabbat, meaning we observe certain practices. We guard our souls. So it has this sense of protective embrace, which is key to our understanding of relationship with our ecosystem. Okay, so we'll do the next one. Who would like to read next?
Now Yahweh, God said, it is not good for the human to be alone. I will make him a helper corresponding to him. So Yahweh, God formed from the soil every living thing of the field and every fowl of the heavens, and brought each to the human to see what he would call it. And whatever the human called it as a living being, that became its name. The human called out names for every herd animal, and for the fowl of the heavens, and for every living thing of the field. But for the human, there could be found no helper corresponding to him.
So the things that really pop out of this text is that this really struck me for the first time in this study, is that God formed from the soil every living thing. So we are created of the same stuff that God creates everything else, which also speaks with that intimate, it's almost like we're siblings with all of created order. It's not that they are other or done. And in this text, the living things come after the creation of human, whereas in the first story, all of the living things are created and then the humans. And there's this notion of community and companionship that is also key to this passage. And the seeking for a companion. And I don't believe that helper is a secondary language in this piece. It's often been used so historically, but it has more this sense of, I think, a co-equal, and we're going to get into that a little bit more, although we could do a full hour on the next slide. So, so who would like to read next?
God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God did he create it. Male and female he created them. So Yahweh God caused a deep slumber to fall on the human. So that he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. Yahweh God built the rib that he had taken from the human into a woman, and he brought her to the human.
So I'm going to talk about particularly Jewish teachings on these two texts that are very ancient and yet very timely for our day. The understanding, early rabbis understood that the first text, and this is from the first creation story in Genesis, indicates that the first being had both notions of male and female within one being, that it was not two separate beings that were created by God. So I've heard Rabbi Susan talk about that the fullness of humanity contains both. Right? So this becomes really important as we understand many different things about gender, gender identity, gender fluidity in these days. The second text, often the rabbis yoke these two together from two different myths, right? To talk about the fact, so rib, the language of rib can also mean side. So there's the notion that the rabbis teach that this one being with both genders in this text is divided into the two genders so that they can see each other face to face, right? So there's this notion of wholeness, but also seeing face to face, and that this is not, again, often this text has been to say that women are secondary. Women come from this little piece of Adam. Whereas the way the rabbis have interpreted says no, it's like this whole being divided into half, which speaks also of co-equal. Anyway, and again, that we need human companionship and human community as part of our ecosystem is a key teaching here. Okay, so now we're getting to this most critical passage of these texts. So who would like to jump in here?
The woman said to the snake, "From the fruit of the other trees in the garden we may eat, But from the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you are not to eat from it, and you are not to touch it, lest you die. The snake said to the woman, die, you will not die. Rather, God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will become like gods, knowing good and evil. The woman saw that the tree was good for eating, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desirable to contemplate. She took from its fruit and ate, and gave also to her husband beside her, and he ate. The eyes of the two of them were open.
So I'm going to take you to a rather, might be perhaps surprising interpretation of this text. Their Jewish tradition interprets this text very differently from Christianity. Christianity, this is the moment of the fall of original sin. Judaism, and Rabbi Waskow did a huge teaching on this. This is actually a coming of age story. If we can look at the forming of the soil as the earth giving birth to us, this is the moment where humans become, make a decision on their own. They possess free will, and then the knowledge of good and evil. Now, often like this is a teenage coming of age story, right? Where the woman considers what God said, what the snake said, looks at the tree, and says all of these things about the tree and makes a decision on her own. So, and their eyes are opened to good and evil. So this is the moment where humans in this myth become conscious and gain a conscious, right? That can begin to discriminate between good and evil. Which is very, very different than Christian tradition and interpretation of this. So, yes?
Many of you have been doing the Marcus Borg book reading, and there's a tie between what I think the Jewish approach here and what Marcus Borg says, that, it is inevitable that we will have this coming of age, and that moves us away from that Garden of Eden. So there's just a really neat parallel between what you're saying and what Borg teaches on this in slightly different language.
I think if I might add to it as well, Karen, I think these interpretations are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Okay.
I think that's exactly what Lori was suggesting in Marcus Borg's writing, that it is not only a human coming of age story and of human agency, but it's also a story of the imperfection of human agency, hence the archaic term, the fall.
Right, yes. And there are consequences, right, for the imperfection of our agency, and that consequences that we can't stay in the garden, right? We did not follow God's stated boundary.
Once we have to spend a lot of money on clothes, right?
Right. So here's the kind of sweet thing is, if you continue reading, I didn't include this here, but God makes their first set of clothes. So in this set of stories, God is not only a potter and a gardener, but also a tailor. They put on the fig leaf, but God makes them clothes out of skin, which I was so touched by that when I was studying this week. That God kind of sets them on their way kind of well. So then the next slide, I just love this also piece. So this is set after they gain this knowledge of good and evil. They realize that they're naked, and they have to actually face the consequences and their relationship, the brokenness in this relationship with God and not following God's directions. So would somebody read this piece?
Now they heard the sound of Yahweh, God, who was walking about in the garden at the breezy time of the day.
So I love that we encounter God at our hardest moments, right? Here, this is a really hard moment for them in nature, walking around in nature. And this breezy part of the day is likely in the evening. So it's also giving this time code for the day. And this is God begins calling and saying, where are you? Where are you? And they're kind of like, there's this, you know, and it's really a lovely piece to just read and look at the different images of God throughout this piece and how God is interrelating and interacting with humans through nature. And I think there's this notion in this moment also, while there's consequences, there's healing and caring, like I said, with the sewing of the clothes for Adam and Hava. So I see these stories as really central to both of our traditions. And I was talking to my husband this morning, and I see both traditions kind of drawing from this and then saying, okay, we now have the knowledge of good and evil. Now what? How do we apply this in community, in relationship to God, to the earth, to other human beings, to our whole ecosystem, right? How do we apply this? And I didn't pull these passages, but in Christianity, the garden becomes central to the passion and resurrection narratives. And I was just struck by the parallels. Parallels are huge in this kind of writing, right? The gospel writers love to make these bookends, like they start one place and end one place with the same images, right? So here we have the beginning of the Holy Scriptures and the end of Jesus's story, right? Or close to the end with the garden. And so the passion narrative starts in the garden, right? Jesus's prayer in the garden. It also ends in the garden, right? With the first post-resurrection appearances to Mary of Magdala, right? Happening in a garden. So I look at this, and this actually a great Episcopalian priest, this was one of his great teachings when I was in div school, that all of the post-resurrection appearances happen not in the temple, not in the court, right? They happen in a garden, on a road, in a room, in a meal, right? In a meal on a beach. And then I was struck, I was thinking about this, that Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? Yes, feed my sheep, right? So there is this notion of going out and doing justice, right? Going out and healing and taking care of the world that emerges from this. So we're gonna transition. Are there any questions or comments at this point?
It just seems to me, Karen, tying in everything that you taught at the beginning about we are not separate. We are the ecosystem. It's not humans and animals and earth. It's one ecosystem. And then thinking about what you said about the importance of the garden in the death and resurrection of Jesus, that amplifies what Christ's death and resurrection do. If we think of the garden as the symbol for the comprehensive ecosystem, it's not just for humanity that he dies and rises, but for the entire ecosystem, which then ties back to the song that you started with, I think, and gives, to me, even more power, if possible, to the resurrection than when you think about it in that ecosystem way.
Any others? Okay, so I want to look a little bit at the liturgical cycle first, and then some individual spiritual practices. So I'm going to jump. So this is just a little, all of the key words that come out of the story and how they're shaped in the world. So we can look at spiritual practices are done through living in relationship with all of this ecosystem, which attune, and this is a Reb Zalman Schachter Shalome notion, that attune our souls to the abiding presence of God. And so in formal liturgy and in formal community, these include liturgical year and rhythm, the lectionary readings, and the daily office and liturgy of the hours, all of which are interwoven with natural rhythms and symbols. I'm going to just touch on this briefly. This is from Trinity Episcopal in Bethlehem. This is their 2019 Liturgical Cycle of the Year. I love that down here, I hope you can see my mouse, it has the whole notion of the growing season in ordinary time. But we see that, so with the liturgical cycle in the Great Christian Wheel, reflects actually the seasons of the year in very in-depth ways. I'm going to mention it, and again, that could be a whole another class. But so there are major feasts which line up with the equinoxes and the solstices. And so John the Baptist's birth is aligned with the summer solstice because his light wanes. And Jesus, whose birth is at the winter solstice, his light increases. Then on the equinoxes, we have Easter is dated as the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. And the fall, I was kind of searching around for what is the fall thing, and I realized it's pushed after the entire harvest season because you are in intense harvest season at the fall equinox. But the feasts of All Saints and All Souls is that feast in the fall. So you almost have these like four corners, right, of these major holidays. And just think, one of my spiritual practices, both when I was Christian and now that I am Jewish, is looking at how what is going on in nature informs what's going on in the liturgical year. And I'm going to talk about Tu B'Shvat, which is the annual birthday of the trees in Judaism, but it takes place during basically when Lent is starting. Okay, so there's these things that are happening with the earth. We're clearing our gardens, right? Of all of the crud of the winter as Lent is starting. Our world looks really, really spare, right? And yet the trees and the plants are actually full of seeds if you go out and observe. So it's also a time when all these new seeds in this fallow period of preparation for springing towards new life, right, in Lent, are being scattered. So with Tu B'Shvat, this is actually, I kind of believe Tu B'Shvat has this sense of also preparing for the coming of Passover. It's 2 full moons, right, ahead. But there is this sense of, because in Tu B'Shvat, we actually take care of our trees at that time. So we are pruning away dead wood. We are letting these seeds fly off of the trees and getting ready to plant and we plant parsley at Tu B'Shvat so that we're ready for that redemption and liberation that comes with Passover. And we literally eat the parsley at Passover. So you see these interweavings and actually paying attention during different seasonal cycles as that light wanes, as you're heading into the Christmas cycle through Advent. And what is being prepared, right? What are you waiting and looking at that is going to be illumined by the coming light of Christ? It adds a tremendous beauty to your spiritual practice and the languages, right, that you're going to be hearing seasonally in your liturgy. And I would suggest actually going outside to try to experience it. And priests in the room, even having some prayer outside, some formal prayer outside, leading prayer, so that you can really dive into this experience. The other piece is the daily office, which some, I know that it's prayed by both clergy and laity. That is literally called the Liturgy of the Hours because it is timed with the hours of the day. And so if you actually pray those in outdoors, you will find this incredibly powerful resonance with what is going on with the light and the daytime energy with what is going on in the prayers. The lectionary cycle, which reflects the liturgical cycle, is full of natural imagery. the lilies of the field, the mustard seed. Take a moment when you hear those in church and in liturgy, take a note and then go explore. Use your imagination and dive deeper into what is Jesus saying? What is the gospel writer saying? What is the writer of whatever text or even him saying by using all this and a lot of this is metaphorical for God, right? What are all those images saying? How do they inform you? We just have a few more minutes. I want to talk a little bit about praying with our feet and then grounding that in personal spiritual practice. So praying with our feet, this is actually Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Martin Luther King, talked about his marching with King at Selma as praying with his feet. We talk about it at the CRC Mitzvah Farm as praying with our whole bodies, because we're using our whole bodies as we're gardening, as Debbie knows, and as you guys know with your work at the garden. But, you know, the health and the wholeness of our entire ecosystem depends on the health and the wholeness of each and every member, right? Everything. So I think a key question, we all have our own lanes, right? In taking our spiritual practices and taking those into the world. But how do we use our knowledge of good and evil to care for an entire ecosystem, including ourselves? And this is important because in our culture, we want to sublimate ourselves to everything else. And it's a really bad habit that we have, and we don't hold ourselves equal often in that equation. How do I create a blend of practices to be a shomer or guardian of the whole ecosystem? And I think it's really important, right, to ground these practices both in the communal liturgy of the church, right, but also in our own practices, our own personal practices, and have an awareness that our range of practices, right, and I just threw a bunch of these out there, are all spiritual practices in and of themselves. Self-care, gardening, feeding the hungry, all of those things we do are spiritual practice. Sometimes they feel divorced from. I tried personally to get to the garden early. I've not been real successful, to actually ground myself before I greet the gardeners and to really remember and ground myself in the fact that we are about to do holy work together when we're at the garden. Okay, just to, so in personal prayer, we have just a couple of more slides. So one of the things that I do a lot is Lectio Divina of the earth, or Torah of the earth, which is actually really what I was saying before with the liturgical cycle. When you're outside in nature, look at what's going on, right? Is it a growth time? Is it a barren time? Is it you know, what is going on in nature and what does that have to teach you? This morning, I sit out on my patio, my little patio every morning, and the wind was just, the cool breezes were amazing. I thought, wow, this is really amazing. I have this opportunity to pray and be with this beautiful community, to be wrapped in spirit this way this morning, and to feel that connection of everything with spirit. So it's a wonderful practice to inform your prayer, or take one of your prayers, an image from your prayer, and take it outdoors. The blessing pause. This is a Jewish thing, which I just love. Jews bless everything, right? There's this whole notion you should have 100 more, Debbie, is it 600 blessings a day, right? Which basically mean to pause, to notice, to sink in. One of our blessings is the Shehekianu, which is about that new moment. So this is used for everything from a birthday to the start of Passover to that first bite of a peach, right? Of the first peach, right? That's the new peach of the year. Like you wouldn't do it for every peach. So we just got homegrown, locally grown peaches at our house and we Shehekianu'd it, right? So, but it's that pause that sinks you into the moment. So if you see something incredible in nature, it's, you know, in Hebrew, it's Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, but you can just say, blessed are you, God, for the gift of this, and allow yourself to really, really notice on all levels. It's as simple as that. And then just praying outdoors can be an amazing multi-sensory, beautiful grounding thing. To take your morning, your evening prayer, your prayer time, and just open oneself to God's Spirit through the energy of nature. Like, I try to practice this and not actually bring any word, but just experience and attune to divinity is found in nature. So this is an incredible prayer and notion. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav struggled tremendously with depression. And this, he came with this whole notion of praying in nature and how it elevated his practice of prayer and his own beingness. So would somebody like to read this for us?
Grant me the ability to be alone. May it be my custom to go outdoors each day, among the trees and the grass, among all growing things, and there may I be alone, and enter into prayer to talk with the one to whom I belong. May I express there everything in my heart, and may all the foliage of the field, all the grasses, trees, and plants awaken at my coming, to send the powers of their life into the words of my prayer. My prayer and speech are made whole through the life and spirit of all growing things, which are made up as one by their transcendent source. May I then pour out the words of my heart before your presence like water, O God, and lift up my hands to you in worship on my behalf and that of my children.
Thanks, Debbie. And I think the other piece that can be really powerful is using your own creative practices to respond. Our traditions, right, are rooted in this response to the ecosystem that we live in. So singing and music, journaling, writing haiku about nature you notice, and writing your own psalm can be very, very powerful ways. You know, the Psalms are like these incredibly expressive poems that are very grounded in natural imagery, but can be very, very powerful ways to respond and deepen your own awareness of God in nature, the sanctity of it all, and our place in this incredibly powerful and beautiful ecosystem. So I think we'll end there today. I'm so grateful to have had this time with you. Are there any questions or comments? I guess I should have.
Thank you so much. It